So tell me, what's going on here? Because you say that there's some changes in the memory market in particular. The buying activity, is this about sentiment? Is this about people stocking up? Is it going to have impact as the year wears on?
Yeah, I think so. The two companies we upgraded are both manufacturers of semiconductor memory, which has these commodity-like characteristics, very high-quality commodity and high-margin commodity, but it's still a commodity. And we've seen prices go up really since the fourth quarter, and we've missed a big move by being a little bit skeptical about that early on. But in the fourth quarter, a lot of the strength that we were seeing was being attributed to the things you're referencing. There was inventory build, there was some tariff anxiety, there was product being pre-built, and a lot of the channel checks we had said, we would get past these December 15th potential tariff, and there would be a little bit of an air pocket in demand. And what we've seen since then, in the last 30 days, we've seen quite good demand. We've seen firming of pricing, and we've seen really across all of our channel checks a conviction that prices are going to continue to move higher through the year. And I think even with the stocks having done what they've done, I think if you look relative to the rest of semiconductors, there's positive ramifications for where these stocks can go if indeed those commodities do stay strong.
Joseph, these stocks have been sensitive to trade headlines. Is that why they're firming up, perhaps, having to do with the expected phase one deal and then the signing of that? Is it something else, or is this volatility that we could see continue? I mean, things look good now, but in a couple of weeks, they might swing the other way.
Yeah, well, I think it's certainly been a pretty big aspect to what's happening. And I think, the tariffs that were supposed to go into place on December 15th, that eventually ended up not going into place, that pretty big ramifications for memory. And so I did feel like at the time that there was some pre-building in front of those tariffs. I think getting that date behind us, not implementing those tariffs, the phase one deal is probably less of a factor than just not having that be the major factor. And so I do think that that the demand we're seeing now is a little bit more responsive to demand. Now, there are anxieties globally about the ability to procure things. There is a willingness for customers to hold more inventory. And so I think you're right that we have to keep a pretty close eye on it. But I think when we see the conviction that we're hearing now that prices will continue to move up, and we're seeing in some cases in the NAND space, which is one of the major commodities, we're seeing outright tight supply, even in seasonal weakness. There's pretty high conviction that that's going to persist through the year. And so unless there's a real demand side shock that changes that conviction, it's pretty hard for me to see that inventory, immediately getting drawn back down.
Joseph, to your point, I mean, we have seen revenues come down for many of these names in recent quarters, and I realize we're working through inventory here. We've seen a correction in the market. More broadly, you're talking about, the firming up and even increasing in pricing for some of these semiconductors as well. But given the pretty dramatic re-rating we've seen in the stocks betting on this bottom, at what point do valuations look stretched?
Yeah, I think that's 100% right. I think, over the course of last year, we saw very weak fundamentals and very strong stock performance. And so the whole group has really re-rated. So I think the question now that things are actually getting better is who's earned that re-rating? Where are the companies where that downturn looked more shallow than what we've seen in the past? And following what was a fairly strong upturn for memory in 2017 and 18, I think we're going to look at these stocks and say, okay, this trough, and we were fairly cautious over the course of last year across all semiconductors, and there were a bunch of negative demand indications that we saw in this memory space. And, I think, though, that now that it's kind of bottoming out, I think you look at that and say, okay, in memory, we had a very challenging conditions. We had demand at kind of 2009 levels of demand growth, and yet we're bottoming at margin levels in the case of Micron, that are, close to the levels that they peaked at just a few years ago. And so I think it really suggests, yes, the whole sector's re-rated. Our call today is, these semiconductor companies, certainly relative to my own expectations, have earned that re-rating by showing us the shallow nature of the downturn. And certainly those are the stocks that have the most leverage if you do think that this improvement that we're seeing continues.
You don't shy away from the notion that there might be some pull forward of demand, particularly in China. You raise the risk that maybe 5G gets deferred as a consumer buy. I mean, how serious would you rate those risks?
Well, they're pretty material risks, I think, over the long haul. I think that to put that in perspective, though, there is always an aspect of that. When particularly in these price-sensitive commodity areas, when prices bottom out, the customers are always more willing to hold inventory. And so we're certainly seeing that now. They're particularly coming off of what were fairly severe shortages, 2017 and 18. there is a willingness to hold inventory, and that is part of what's going on. As to whether that's specifically China, the data doesn't really show that. Like there have been some pull forwards in China for sure, but we've seen China as a percentage of global DRAM go up by a couple of points. Sort of 42% to 44% of revenue. So it's been a small change, and Micron's made cautionary comments, but it's a relatively small part of their business. So I think it's something to watch, and I think we are going to need demand follow through. Right now we have pretty good demand in cloud. Pretty good demand in PCs that's likely to slow over the year, and then smartphones where I think the builds have been pretty good. We have to see where demand comes out. So certainly you're going to have to watch those factors. But I think right now when you put all that together, it still looks like a pretty strong environment for memory, particularly for NAND, where we're seeing prices actually rising.